Hello and welcome to Cognitive Drift. What does it really mean to be good? Is it something we do out of fear of punishment or hope for a reward? Or is it something deeper, something woven into the way we live and relate to others, regardless of what we believe? This question, can you be good without God, isn't really about goodness, it's about control, about who gets to define morality and who gets to decide what's right and wrong for everyone else. Some people are taught from an early age that morality comes from a higher power, that without divine commandments, human beings would spiral into chaos. The assumption is that if you remove God, you remove ethics. But that's not how it works in reality. Let's start with something very basic. When a child shares a toy, when a teenager stands up for a friend, or when a stranger helps someone across the street, do we stop and ask what religion they belong to? Probably not, because decency, empathy, compassion, they're not the property of any religion. They're just part of what it means to be human. There's this old claim that without a divine lawgiver, morality becomes subjective, but morality has always been shaped by culture, experience, reflection, and empathy, not just by what's written in a book. Religious texts often claim to offer absolute moral standards, but if you read them closely, those standards vary wildly, and sometimes even contradict basic human dignity. Slavery, stoning, divine vengeance, these are all defended at some point in many holy books. Are those the standards we're supposed to call objective? Or is it possible we've been using our own judgment all along, even when reading those texts? We don't need a supernatural being to tell us that harming others is wrong. We don't need ancient commandments to recognize fairness, honesty, or kindness. Those things don't come from the sky. They come from lived experience and from a deep, evolved sense of cooperation that helped human beings survive. Anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists have found that moral behavior shows up in every known society and even in animals. Primates show empathy, dolphins cooperate, elephants grieve. These behaviors didn't come from religious teachings. They developed because they helped species live together and thrive. And when we look at the data, it tells a clear story. Some of the most peaceful, safest, and most ethical societies in the world, places like Sweden, Norway, Japan, are also among the least religious. People there tend to trust each other more, commit fewer crimes, and show strong social support, not because they fear divine judgment, but because they value human well-being. Meanwhile, some of the most religious societies on Earth are also among the most violent, corrupt, or unequal. That's not to say religion causes those things, but it definitely doesn't prevent them. Morality isn't about who you worship. It's about how you treat people. And that raises another question. If someone only acts ethically because they're afraid of divine punishment, is that really morality? Or is that just fear dressed up as virtue? There's a deeper kind of goodness, the kind that doesn't come from threats, but from values, from a sense of shared humanity. That kind of morality isn't always easy, but it's real. It doesn't depend on being watched. It depends on caring. And that's where the real misunderstanding begins. There's a myth that without belief in God, people just start doing whatever they want. But most people, religious or not, don't want to lie, cheat, or steal, not because someone's watching them, but because it hurts others and it damages trust. We don't need divine permission to know that human beings matter, that suffering is real, that other people's pain is just as important as our own, that knowledge doesn't come from above, it comes from connection. And yet, some religious voices still say that without God, life has no meaning, that without divine guidance, there's no basis for morality. But here's the thing. If your only reason for being good is the hope of eternal reward or the fear of eternal punishment, is that really morality, or is it just a transaction? Real ethics don't come from a bargain. They come from awareness, from being able to look someone in the eye and recognize that their life has value, even if there's no cosmic scoreboard keeping track. And what about people who don't believe in God but still risk their lives to help others, who stand up against injustice, who care for strangers? Are they not moral? Or are they doing good simply because it's the right thing to do? Morality without religion isn't just possible, it's already happening, all over the world, every day, quietly, without any divine spotlight. And in many ways, it's even more powerful because it's not driven by obedience, it's chosen freely. That freedom matters because when morality is chosen, not imposed, it becomes something people actually believe in, not just something they perform to avoid punishment. There's also something we rarely talk about, the way religious morality often relies on authority rather than reason. In many traditions, something is considered right or wrong not because of its consequences or its impact on others, but simply because it's been declared so by a higher power. This creates a kind of moral obedience, not moral understanding. For example, if a religious text says a certain behavior is sinful, then it's condemned, even if it causes no harm to anyone. And if a divine command says something violent or unjust is acceptable, then it's often justified, simply because it was commanded. But when we rely on reason and empathy instead of obedience, we don't stop at "because I was told so." We ask deeper questions. Is this action kind? Is it fair? Does it help or harm? Is it honest? That process, the act of thinking ethically, not just following rules, is something we teach kids from an early age. And most of us would agree it's better for people to understand why something is right or wrong, not just memorize a list of do's and don'ts. There's also the issue of conflicting moral commands across different religions. One tradition says this is good, another says it's evil. One says charity is the highest virtue, another says obedience is. So whose God gets to decide which version of morality is the true one? The fact that no one agrees tells us something important. Morality isn't coming from a single divine source. It's evolving, it's negotiated, it's built collectively. And that's not a weakness, it's a strength, because it means we can improve. Human morality today is far more humane than it was centuries ago. We no longer see slavery as acceptable. We've moved toward equality for women, racial minorities, LGBTQ+ people. We've developed systems for human rights, international law, and restorative justice. And many of these changes happened not because of religion, but in spite of it. Throughout history, religious institutions have often been the last to change, not the first. From Galileo to abolitions to suffragettes, the people pushing moral progress were usually the ones challenging religious authority, not obeying it. And when we look around today, we can see that same dynamic playing out. People are standing up for justice, equality, and human dignity not because they're told to by religious leaders, but because they care about what's fair and what's right. Of course, some religious people care deeply about these things too, and many of them do incredible work for others. But the point is that goodness doesn't require belief, it requires conscience. And when your conscience is your guide, morality becomes more consistent, more personal, and more accountable. There's no divine loophole, no holy exception clause, no ritual that erases wrongdoing. You take responsibility for your actions. Not because you're afraid of hell, but because you want to be a decent person. And yet there's still this suspicion in some parts of society that people without religious beliefs can't be trusted, that if you don't believe in God, you must be morally adrift. But studies show otherwise. In fact, research from the Pew Research Center, Gallup, and others consistently shows that people who identify as non-religious are just as likely, and sometimes more likely, to support ethical causes, give to charity, volunteer, or respect human rights. When you remove divine command, people don't collapse into selfishness. In many cases, they become more thoughtful, more deliberate, more conscious of the real-world impact of their behavior. And there's a kind of honesty in that, because you're not acting from fear or for some cosmic prize. You're acting because you care, because you've thought about it, because you know what it means to suffer, and you don't want to be the cause of that in someone else's life. In a way, morality without religion is more demanding, not less. There's no script, no promise that everything will be rewarded in the afterlife, no invisible judge to absolve you, just you, your actions, and the world you're helping to shape. And that's where ethics really matters, not in abstract rules from ancient texts, but in how we treat people, in how we deal with power, in how we handle honesty when no one is watching. Some of the worst moral atrocities in history were carried out in the name of divine authority and justified by Scripture. From the Crusades, to the Inquisition, to colonial conquest and religious wars, blind obedience to religious authority has never guaranteed moral behavior. It's often been the opposite. What we need isn't more obedience, it's more awareness. More humility, more compassion, more critical thinking. And those things don't require faith. They require effort. And it's worth asking, who benefits from the idea that morality must come from God? Because once you accept that idea, it puts certain people, priests, imams, preachers, in the position of gatekeepers. They claim to speak on behalf of the divine, and suddenly questioning them becomes morally suspect. This isn't about faith, it's about control. If goodness only comes from a divine source, then human beings are seen as flawed by default, incapable of deciding right and wrong on their own. That idea makes people easier to manage, easier to guilt, easier to intimidate. But the truth is, we've been figuring out right and wrong long before organized religion existed, and we're still figuring it out now, through philosophy, law, literature, relationships, lived experience. We debate moral issues in courts, classrooms, and communities, not temples. And the more open we are to that process, the better our moral reasoning gets. If someone tells you that without belief in God, nothing really matters, ask yourself, is that true? Or is it just a way to discourage people from thinking for themselves? Because when someone says, without God, there's no right or wrong, what they're really saying is, without my version of God, I don't trust you to be good. But why not? Why assume that people need to be watched in order to act decently? Why assume that morality is so fragile it can only survive under surveillance? That view of human nature is incredibly cynical, and it doesn't match reality. People do good all the time, even when there's no reward, even when there's a cost, sometimes even when no one will ever know. That's not weakness. That's moral strength. And when someone gives credit to God for all human goodness, they ignore the courage, struggle, and sacrifice that people actually go through. It takes something real to stand up for what's right when it's hard, when it's unpopular, when it doesn't come with divine validation. Think about those who risked everything to protect others during times of genocide, who stood against racism, tyranny, or oppression. Many of them weren't acting because of religious commandments. They were acting because their conscience wouldn't let them stay silent. That kind of moral courage doesn't come from a rule book. It comes from integrity. And it's not rare. We see it in whistleblowers who expose corruption, in doctors who work in war zones, in activists who push for justice, in everyday people who do the right thing even when no one's clapping. That's morality without God, not because they're rebelling against religion, but because they're responding to the real needs of real people. And that's the key. Morality, grounded in reality, not myth, not dogma, tends to be more compassionate, more adaptable, and more accountable. It doesn't rely on divine threats. It relies on empathy and evidence. If lying damages trust, we avoid it. If violence causes harm, we condemn it. If exclusion creates suffering, we challenge it. We don't need scripture to tell us that. We need perspective. And the more connected we are, to each other, to the world, to the consequences of our actions, the more clearly we see what's right. It's not that humans are perfect, far from it, but we are capable of learning, growing, and making better choices. And sometimes, believing in yourself, in your ability to be moral, thoughtful, and kind without divine oversight, is one of the most powerful things you can do. It means you own your choices, not just follow them. It means you think critically, not just conform. It means your goodness is yours, not borrowed, not threatened, not bartered for eternal rewards. And that kind of morality is real. There's a quiet strength in being good without needing permission. No need for promises of paradise, no fear of eternal flames, just a clear understanding that your actions affect other people and that those people matter. And maybe that's what makes secular morality so unsettling to some. It doesn't depend on cosmic hierarchy. It doesn't appeal to authority. It just says, do the right thing because it's right. That puts the weight of ethics back where it belongs, in our hand. Not in ancient commandments, not in ritual, not in belief, but in responsibility. And with that responsibility comes freedom. The freedom to change your mind when the evidence changes. The freedom to admit when you're wrong and try again. The freedom to develop a sense of right and wrong that's rooted in the real world, in people's actual lives, not in metaphysical claims or religious doctrine. And here's the interesting thing. When people start thinking this way, they often become more moral, not less. Not because they're trying to be perfect, but because they're trying to be honest. It's easy to follow rules. It's harder to ask hard questions. It's easy to say, God says this is wrong. It's harder to say, let's talk about why this might be harmful. But that deeper kind of ethics, the kind that involves thinking, questioning, and adjusting, is what makes progress possible. Think about how far we've come. Just a few generations ago, things like segregation, marital rape, and the criminalization of homosexuality were accepted or even defended by religious institutions. It wasn't faith that changed that. It was people who looked around and said, this isn't right. And when you start from empathy, from a sense that other people's lives are as important as your own, you begin to see morality as something alive, something that grows as we grow. That's the opposite of blind obedience. And it's more sustainable too. Because when you stop relying on divine punishment or reward to keep people in line, you start building communities where trust, cooperation, and care are the norm, not the exception. And those values don't vanish when belief fades. In fact, many people who walk away from religion don't become less ethical, they just become more intentional about it. They stop outsourcing their conscience and start developing it. And yes, it's harder that way. Because when you mess up, you can't just confess and call it done. You have to take real responsibility. But that's part of growing up. Mature morality isn't about fear of punishment. It's about doing the right thing when there's no one to impress, no reward on the line. It's what you do when you're not being watched. And for a lot of people, that kind of goodness means more because it's not a performance. It's who they are, and it shows up in all the small, unremarkable ways that never make headlines. Returning a wallet, listening when someone's struggling, admitting when they're wrong, even when it stings, choosing fairness over convenience. These aren't miracles, they're just signs of character. And they don't require faith. They require humanity. And when you strip it all down, that's what morality is really about. It's not about where you think we came from or what happens after we die. It's about what we do while we're here, with each other, with the time we have. Do you treat people with respect? Do you take responsibility for your choices? Do you care about the impact you leave behind? You don't need divine commands to answer those questions. You just need awareness and a willingness to care. And if someone says, without God, there's no foundation for morality, maybe we should ask, What kind of foundation are they really talking about? Because if your morality can't stand on its own, if it collapses the moment belief disappears, then maybe it was never that strong to begin with. Real morality doesn't need to be propped up by threats or bribes. It needs honesty, compassion, and courage. It means doing the work of figuring things out for yourself, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. It means taking other people seriously, even when you don't agree with them, even when no one's keeping score. It means understanding that goodness isn't about being perfect or pure. It's about effort and growth and taking care not to cause harm. That's not a religious idea. That's a human one. And yes, people mess up all the time. We lie, we hurt each other, we act selfishly, whether we believe in gods or not. But the point isn't whether we fail, the point is whether we try to do better. And when you don't have a divine authority telling you what to do, you don't just copy the answers, you have to wrestle with the questions. And that wrestling, that slow, careful effort to live with integrity, that's where real morality lives. Not in absolutes, not in ancient laws carved in stone, but in our choices, in our relationships, in the way we respond to suffering and injustice and everyday life. Can you be good without God? Not only can you might be more likely to, if your ethics are grounded in reason and not in fear, in empathy, not obedience, in reality, not revelation. Because when goodness comes from within, when it's chosen freely and lived honestly, it becomes something deeper, something more reliable, something real. And that kind of goodness doesn't need permission.